The chamber was enormous. The kind of enormous that made a person feel like a mistake. Curved walls rose up into a ceiling so far above that the light reaching it was a different color than the light at the floor. Hundreds of seats. Hundreds of species. Hundreds of eyes, stalks, membranes, and sensory clusters, all pointed at one small woman, standing behind a single podium, at the center of it all. Ambassador Yara Osei did not fidget. She stood the way she always stood, straight back, hands loose at her sides, face arranged into something that gave nothing away. She had been standing in rooms like this for 22 years. She had learned early that the moment you let a room make you feel small, you were finished. The tally board above the chamber floor was still counting. It did not need to count. Everyone already knew. 217 votes for Exile. 1 abstention. The Keth delegate in the upper left cluster was now leaning away from her own vote button as though she had never touched it. Yara watched her for a moment, then looked away. It didn't matter. Council Chair Oren rose from his elevated seat. He was tall, gray-skinned, and moved like a man who had been important for so long that importance had become a physical quality, something in the way his joints worked. He tapped the speaking crystal once. The chamber went silent. He read from the formal document. He read slowly, the way people read when they want the words to hurt. The charges were 14 counts of unauthorized first contact, 7 acts of what the Council's legal division had classified as aggressive diplomacy, which meant that at some point a human had solved a problem in a way that alarmed everyone watching. There was the Talari incident, which involved a misunderstanding about what a handshake meant to a species with boneless upper limbs. There was the breeding program misunderstanding, which was worse than it sounded, and also, somehow better. And there was the time. A cultural attaché from the Pacific Coalition had read that the Voreth delegation responded positively to harmonic sound, and had organized a 45-minute concert in the receiving hall, featuring 11 humans singing folk songs from 6 different countries, none of which the Voreth had enjoyed, all of which had been performed with great enthusiasm. There was a longer list. There was always a longer list with humanity. Oren set the document down. He looked at Yara. The Council finds that the species known as humanity, represented by the planet Earth and its affiliated settlements, has demonstrated a persistent and irreversible inability to function within the frameworks, agreements, and social contracts that govern civilized interstellar life. He paused. The Council votes to remove Earth from all membership categories, to close all registered trade corridors, to quarantine the solar system under Class 4 restriction. Another pause. This exile is permanent. The word permanent landed in the room and stayed there. Yara waited 3 seconds. She counted them. Then she stepped up to the speaking crystal. She looked at the tally board. She looked at Oren. She looked briefly at the Keth delegate, who was still pretending she had nothing to do with any of this. On behalf of Earth, Yara said, I accept the exile. The room did a strange thing. It went even quieter than it already was, which should not have been possible. We'll see ourselves out. She stepped back from the crystal. She picked up her folder. One folder, thin. She had never needed much paper. And she turned and walked toward the exit corridor at the back of the chamber floor. No one spoke. Her footsteps were the only sound. The corridor was long and curved and empty. White light from panels overhead. The faint hum of the station's ventilation. The smell of recycled air that had been through 100 different alien respiratory systems. She walked, and she did not look back. And she kept her face exactly where she had left it, arranged and closed, and giving nothing away. She was almost to the transit hub when it happened. She stopped walking. She stood in the middle of the corridor, alone. No cameras, no delegates, no tally boards counting up the ways the universe had decided her planet was too much trouble. She stood there, and she felt something move across her face before she could organize herself enough to stop it. It was not relief. It was not joy. It was not the particular flavor of bitter that she had been carrying in her chest for 6 years of meetings and negotiations and formal apologies on behalf of a species that was genuinely, structurally incapable of doing things the approved way. It was recognition. The specific, clean feeling of understanding something that has just been confirmed. She had known this vote was coming. She had known it for 6 years. She had watched the council's patience wear down meeting by meeting, incident by incident, handshake by handshake. She had filed the reports. She had written the analysis. She had sent it back to Earth with a subject line that said, plainly, "They are going to exile us," and received back a reply from the Deputy Secretary of Alien Affairs that said, "Let's not catastrophize, Yara." She had not catastrophized. She had prepared. The transit pod arrived, and she stepped in and the door slid closed, and she was alone in a small moving capsule shooting through the body of Velthari Station, and in the privacy of that small space, she let the expression finish crossing her face. It was almost a smile, not quite, something quieter than a smile. Something that lived in the corners of the mouth and the particular stillness of the eyes. They had exiled Earth to protect the Council's careful order, the approved routes, the managed contacts, the slow, supervised expansion of civilization according to rules written by species who had decided, a long time ago, that careful was the same thing as correct. They had looked at humanity, loud, wrong-footed, enthusiastic, catastrophically bad at asking permission, and they had made a decision. They had taken the leash off. Yara looked at the small window in the transit pod. Stars outside, a lot of them, more than anyone had counted yet, because the Council's exploration licenses only covered so much territory, and the rest had just been sitting there, dark and unregistered, and full of doors no one had tried yet. She thought about Cho. She thought about the fleet he had spent 30 years building. She thought about Priya Nayar's research requests that the Council Scientific Board had been rejecting for 4 years on the grounds that certain areas of space were not ready for human contact, which Yara had always privately translated as, "We are not ready for what happens when humans make contact." She thought about the 47-page document sitting in a secure file on her personal drive, the one she had been drafting and revising and waiting to use for 2 years. She had never needed permission to write it. She had never needed permission for any of it. Neither did Earth. That was the thing the Council had never understood, in all its meetings and its charges, and its formal readings of formal documents in an enormous room designed to make people feel like mistakes. They thought exile was a punishment. They had no idea what they had just handed over. The transit pod stopped. The door opened. Yara picked up her folder and stepped out into the departure bay. She had a ship to catch. She had a call to make. She had a planet to brief. She had work to do. She straightened her jacket. She walked toward the gate. The smile had already gone back to wherever she kept it, tucked away, out of sight. Her face was closed and professional, and gave nothing at all to anyone watching. But it had been there. It had been there in that corridor, alone, just for a moment. And it had felt, more than anything else she had felt in 22 years of standing in rooms built to make her feel small, like the beginning of something. 8 months after the exile, Admiral Daejung Cho stood in front of a map that should not have existed. It covered the entire wall of the briefing room on Lunar Command Station. Someone had printed it in segments and taped the segments together, because no single printer on the station was wide enough to handle it in one piece. The tape showed at the seams. Cho had looked at it for 30 seconds when he first walked in, at the tape and the uneven segments and the slightly mismatched colors at the joins, and had decided he liked it exactly as it was. The map showed known space. The Council's approved corridors ran through it in clean blue lines, neat, authorized, going exactly where the Council had decided it was acceptable to go. Cho had drawn those in himself, with a blue marker, the first morning he had the map up. He wanted everyone in the room to see them clearly. Then he had drawn humanity's new routes in red. The red lines went everywhere the blue lines didn't. They curved around the quarantine boundary like water around a stone. They pushed into sectors the Council had marked as unnavigable, which turned out to mean, we haven't tried very hard. They connected points that the Council's cartography had never bothered to link, because the Council had no particular reason to go there. Humanity had reasons. Humanity had always had reasons. The Council just hadn't been interested in hearing them. 43 new settlements in 8 months. Cho had put a small red dot at each one. Some of the dots were still blinking, which meant the settlement was new enough that the status reports were still coming in irregular. He liked the blinking dots too. They meant something was alive out there, and still figuring itself out. He turned to face the room. 12 officers, 2 civilian analysts, 1 very tired communications director named Brennan, who had been awake for 19 hours and was drinking something out of a thermal cup that smelled like it had been brewed in a machine that needed cleaning. Status on the furthest shore settlements, Cho said. Lieutenant Park, 26 years old, ruthlessly competent, incapable of being impressed by anything, which Cho valued enormously, stood up with a tablet. Kepler Station 7 is fully operational, self-sustaining food production as of 6 weeks ago. They found a mineral deposit in the third moon's outer crust that our geologists say shouldn't be there. She paused. They're very happy about it. Noted. Outpost Vera is running about 3 months behind on construction because someone approved the colony ship manifest that included 40% more people than the habitat modules were rated for. Who approved that? The colonists, sir. Informally. Cho looked at the map. The dot for Outpost Vera was blinking. And? They built more modules. Local materials. The engineers back home are studying the technique. Park moved to the next item. New Carthage has sent a trade inquiry to the Drath home system. The room went a degree or two quieter. The Drath had a reputation. The Council had classified them under what it diplomatically called aggressive contact parameters, which meant that every other species in the Council had quietly decided that interacting with the Drath was more trouble than it was worth. The Drath were large, blunt, territorial, and possessed of a cultural framework that interpreted caution as weakness and weakness as an invitation. The Council had been managing the Drath at a careful distance for 60 years. New Carthage had sent them a metals trade inquiry in month 3. They said yes? Cho asked. They said yes and asked if we had more to offer. Park looked up from the tablet. We did. Cho looked at the map again. The Drath home system was deep in territory the Council had flagged as restricted. There was a small new red dot near it. It had not been there last week. He had not authorized that dot. Someone had put a settlement there. Someone had looked at the restricted flag and the Drath reputation and the Council's 60 years of careful distance and had decided that the smart move was to go say hello. He probably should have felt something about that. Concern, maybe. A flicker of the disciplined worry that had run the back of his brain for 30 years while he built a fleet the Council kept asking him to justify. He did not feel concern. He made a note to send the settlement to commendation and more supply pods. Research division, he said. The civilian analyst, Dr. Voss, astrophysics, the kind of person who answered every question as though it were the most interesting question anyone had ever asked, sat up straighter. The licensing board rejections have created a situation, she said. We had 47 active research projects that the Council's scientific authority had either restricted or denied outright, most of them in the outer sectors. Since the exile, we have proceeded with all 47. Results? 14 have produced findings that directly contradict existing Council models. She said it pleasantly, like someone reporting good weather. 3 of them in a way that's going to require entirely new models. We've begun publishing. There's no license required for the entities we're publishing to. Cho said, which entities? The ones the Council hasn't formally recognized yet. She smiled. There are quite a few of them. The room held that for a moment. 8 months ago the Council had shut every door, closed every route, revoked every license, put up a quarantine boundary around humanity's solar system, and written permanent at the bottom of the document with the gravity of people who believed that words like permanent meant what they said. They had been thinking of the quarantine as a wall. It wasn't a wall, and humanity had simply stepped over it and kept walking. The Council Communications, Cho said. Brennan, the tired communications director, set down his thermal cup. 14 attempts to raise contact in the past 30 days, all through official channels, all requesting dialogue. He paused. 6 of them specifically mentioned the new trade routes. The room was quiet again. Cho looked at the red lines on the map. He looked at the 43 dots. He looked at the blinking ones, alive and still figuring themselves out, which was the natural state of anything human. The Owen, he said. Park pulled up a separate file. Priya Nair's team made formal contact in month 5. The Council classified the Owen as non-sapient, pre-contact primitive species, essentially off-limits. She read from the file. Dr. Nair's assessment is that the Council's sapience classification rubric was built by species who define intelligence by similarity to themselves. A pause. Her exact phrase was, catastrophically narrow-minded, but that's the summary version. And the Owen? They have been sharing research with Dr. Nair's team for 3 months. Xenobiology, chemistry, something in the area of material science that our engineers are still trying to understand. Park looked up. They seem to like us. Most species do, Cho said, once they figure out we're not going to follow the script. He turned back to the map. Someone knocked on the briefing room door and opened it without waiting. An ensign, young, a little out of breath. Sir, Council envoy vessel on approach to the quarantine line. They're requesting permission to dock at Gateway Station. The room looked at Cho. Cho looked at the map. All those red lines, all those dots, the blinking ones, still alive, still building, still figuring it out without asking anyone if it was okay. Tell Gateway Station to respond to the envoy. What should we tell them? Cho picked up his own coffee cup, cold. He had forgotten about it. Tell them Earth is not accepting applications at this time. He drank the cold coffee. He looked at the map. 43 dots. He picked up the red marker. He was going to need more dots. 14 months after the exile, the Council's outer trade network began showing gaps. Not large gaps, not the kind of gaps that made news. Small ones. A cargo corridor that used to carry 17 shipments a cycle, now carrying 12. A fuel depot on the edge of Ket space that used to process 43 vessels a week, now processing 31. A relay station between the Vorith home system and the Council core that had been fully staffed for 60 years, now running on a skeleton crew because 3 of the species that used it regularly had started using a different route. The different route went through human-controlled jump points. It was cheaper, it was faster, and the humans who ran Gateway Station on the quarantine boundary charged a toll that was, by any reasonable measure, very fair. Almost insultingly fair. The kind of fair that made Council economists look at the numbers twice and then sit quietly with the feeling that they were missing something. Council Trade Director Pel Aaron noticed the gaps on a Tuesday. By Wednesday she had a meeting with the full Economic Council. By Thursday she had a very uncomfortable call with Chair Oren, in which she explained using charts that the problem was not going away on its own. Oren listened. He looked at the charts. He asked if this was recoverable. Pel Aaron had been in her job for 30 years. She was not a person given to drama. She looked at her charts for a moment. Not without talking to them, she said. Oren said nothing for a long time. On Lunar Command Station, Cho got a report that morning. He read it over breakfast. He set it down next to his coffee cup and looked at it for a while. Then he sent a short message to Yara on Earth that said only, "The phone is starting to ring." Her reply came back in 4 minutes. Let it. The first real crack came from the Velthari Fringe Worlds. The Fringe Worlds were technically council members. They paid their dues. They attended the sessions. But they were a long way from the core planets. And the core planets had a way of making decisions that benefited the core planets, while describing those decisions as beneficial to everyone. The Fringe Worlds had been quietly resentful about this for about 40 years. They had been quietly resentful in the way that people are quietly resentful when they don't see any option, tolerant on the outside, keeping careful score on the inside. Then humans appeared on their doorstep with trade offers. Not the polished, formal, council-approved kind of trade offer that came with 17 forms and a 3-cycle review process. The human kind, which was a person showing up with a ship full of goods and a willingness to negotiate on the spot, and a complete inability to be offended by a counteroffer. The fringe worlds negotiated. The humans negotiated back. Deals were made inside of a week that would have taken years through council channels. By month 14, 6 fringe world systems were routing a significant portion of their trade through human jump points. They were still council members. They were still paying their dues. They were still attending the sessions and voting on the approved agenda items. They were just also doing business with Earth. The Drath situation was more complicated in the way that anything involving the Drath was more complicated. The Council had spent 60 years managing the Drath by treating them like a problem to be contained. This had not made the Drath feel good about the Council. The Drath, it turned out, were an intensely trade-minded species who had been interpreting the Council's caution as disrespect, and 60 years of feeling disrespected had made them extremely uninterested in participating in any Council economic frameworks. The humans from New Carthage had shown up in month 3 with medals, a blunt negotiating style, and absolutely no awareness of the Drath's reputation as a species to be carefully avoided. They had simply sent a message that said essentially, "We have things, you might want them, are you interested?" The Drath were interested. By month 8, they had a working trade agreement. By month 12, they had a human liaison office in the Drath home system. By month 14, Cho had a report on his desk indicating that 3 Drath cargo vessels had voluntarily passed through Gateway Station, paid the toll politely, and continued into human-controlled space on what the manifest listed as a friendly visit. No species had described a visit to Council space as friendly in recorded memory. The Owen development was the one that made Orin call an emergency session. The Council's classification of the Owen as non-sapient had been a procedural decision made 80 years ago by a review board that had spent 11 days studying the Owen and concluded they lacked the necessary markers for recognized intelligence. The necessary markers, as Priya Nair had been saying loudly for 4 years before the exile, were markers that the review board had designed based on its own species and then applied universally, like measuring everyone's height using a ruler that only went up to 5 feet, and then reporting that everyone was 5 feet tall. The Owen were not non-sapient. They were enormously, quietly, thoroughly intelligent in ways that the Council's rubric had no framework to recognize. And they had been watching the Council make this particular mistake about them for 80 years. When Nair's team made contact in month 5, the Owen had not been surprised. They had not been especially impressed either, because the Owen had been observing spacefaring civilization for a very long time, and their threshold for impressed was set quite high. But they had been interested. Specifically, they had been interested in a species that arrived with no classification forms, no preliminary survey data, and a xenobiologist who had immediately started asking questions instead of making statements. They had started answering. By month 14, Nair's team had received more useful xenobiological data from the Owen than Earth's entire scientific community had collected in 30 years of Council-approved research. 2 of the theoretical frameworks Earth had been using to understand organic chemistry in non-terrestrial environments had been dismantled entirely and replaced with models the Owen provided, which were better in every measurable way. The Owen had also, quietly and without announcing it, begun sending their own ships through human-controlled space. Just enough to establish that they were there, and that they were choosing to be there, and that they had made this choice without asking the Council whether it was acceptable. Orin called the emergency session on a Thursday. Cho got the summary from Yara that evening. He read it standing at the map wall, red marker in hand, a new dot waiting to be placed. The session had apparently been tense. Several Council members had used the word destabilizing. One had used the word catastrophic. The Keth delegate, the one who had abstained at the exile vote and then pretended she hadn't, had apparently asked, in a voice that was trying very hard not to sound desperate, whether there was anything the Council could offer Earth to bring it back into the framework. The room had gone quiet at that, because that was the question no one had wanted to say out loud. That was the admission underneath all the charts and the gap analyses and the emergency sessions. The Council had exiled Earth to protect its order. It had expected Earth to sit in its quarantine box, diminished and isolated, until it either collapsed or begged. Instead, Earth had spent 14 months building a different order, a messier one that had no approved forms, and no review cycles, and no classification rubrics designed to keep things neat. One that included the species the Council had ignored, dismissed, avoided, and condescended to for decades. And those species, it turned out, had been waiting for someone to just show up and talk to them like they mattered. Cho placed the new dot on the map. Then he stepped back and looked at the whole wall. The blue lines, neat, authorized, going exactly where permitted, ran their careful paths through maybe a third of the mapped space. The red lines covered everything else. There were gaps in the red lines too, of course. Empty space, unknown territory, doors not yet kicked in. He picked up the marker again. There was a lot of wall left. Dr. Priya Nair had a notebook problem. She knew it was a problem. She had been told it was a problem by 3 different people on her research team, who had pointed out, reasonably, that everything she wrote in the notebook was also being recorded by the ship's systems and backed up to 4 different servers, and that the notebook was therefore redundant. She had listened to this argument carefully each time it was made. She had then continued using the notebook. The notebook was a physical object. It had weight. When she held it, things felt real in a way that a server backup did not. 22 months after the exile, she was sitting in a contact suite aboard the research vessel Patience, named, someone had once joked, as an aspirational quality, and she was holding the notebook very tightly with both hands. The Mareth Elder on the other side of the contact screen was watching her. The Mareth did not look like the Council's files had suggested they would. The Council's files were 80 years old and had been compiled by a survey team that spent 9 days observing the Mareth from a significant distance before filing a report that classified them as dormant, no contact potential, low technological complexity, recommend continued monitoring only. The survey team had then left. They had observed the Mareth from far away with instruments for 9 days and had concluded, not much going on here. The instruments had been pointed at the wrong things, which was the kind of mistake you made when you already knew what you were looking for and were simply checking whether it was present. The Mareth Elder in front of Priya was approximately 3 meters tall, built in layers like something that had been growing slowly for a very long time and had not yet decided to stop. Its coloring shifted as she watched, not dramatically, not like a display, just a slow movement of pigmentation in the outer layer that her instruments had been logging for 2 weeks without being able to tell her what it meant. She had a hypothesis. She had written it in the notebook. She had drawn a box around it. The translation process was slow. She had 4 layers running. The ship's standard protocol, 2 secondary matrices she had built herself by adapting frameworks UN researchers had shared with her, and a 4th layer that was less translation and more interpretation, a way of flagging when a concept was coming through that had no direct equivalent and needed to be flagged as approximate only. Do not build conclusions on this foundation. A lot of things got flagged. She had asked, 3 days ago, the question she had been building toward since first contact. She had spent 3 days refining the phrasing. She had written 12 drafts in the notebook, crossing out and rewriting, drawing arrows between versions, at one point filling an entire page with the question in different structures, before landing on the one that felt right. The question was, why have you never reached out to the Council? The Mareth Elder had received the question. She knew this because its pigmentation had shifted in a particular pattern that she had come to associate with reception. Not agreement, not processing, specifically reception, the moment when something came in and registered. Then it had been still for 3 days. She had been patient. She had run other tests. She had eaten meals. She had slept badly. She had written other things in the notebook. She had woken up at 2 in the morning on the second day with the thought that maybe she had phrased the question wrong, and it was sitting there being misunderstood, and had spent an hour lying in her bunk, running through alternative translations, before deciding that the question had gone through correctly, and the elder was simply thinking. The Marath, she had come to understand, did not have the same relationship with time that she did. They were old. Not old like a person was old. Old the way geology was old. They had been watching the stars for a length of time that the Council's oldest member species barely covered in total recorded history. They had seen civilizations rise and build their trade routes, and write their classification rubrics, and decide what was and wasn't worthy of contact. And they had watched all of this with the steady, enormous patience of something that had nowhere particular to be. On the third day, the translation system chimed. The response came through in pieces, which was normal. A fourth layer flagged 3 separate concepts as approximate only. She wrote them down in the notebook as they arrived, the flags and all. The full response, assembled, approximated as best the 4 layers could manage. We do not knock on doors. We watch who kicks them in. She read it twice, then she put the pen down. Then she picked it up again and drew a box around it. Then another box around that. She had never double-boxed anything before. She sat for a moment looking at the double box, and then added a third. Her lead researcher, a man named Torres, who had the useful quality of being unflappable, leaned over from his station. He read the translation. He was quiet for a moment. "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means they were waiting," she said. "For us specifically?" She looked at the elder through the contact screen. The pigmentation was doing the reception pattern again, she noticed, which meant it was watching her read its answer, which meant it was watching to see how she received it. "For something like us," she said, "I think." She looked at the 4th layer's flags, approximately. She turned back to her notebook. The Marath were older than the Council by a margin that, when she had first run the dating on their built structures, she had assumed was an instrument error. She had run it again. She had sent the data back to Earth where 3 independent teams had run it again. The margin was real. The Council knew about the Marath. It had to. The survey report was in the Central Archive, 80 years old but filed, indexed, accessible to anyone with clearance. Low complexity. Monitor only. Tucked away. Not worth the trouble of a full contact mission. She thought about what it meant to be that old, to have watched that much, to have seen the Council species find each other and build their neat structure and decide together who was worth talking to and who wasn't. She thought about being classified as not worth talking to and watching the people who made that classification from a distance without letting on that you were watching for 80 years. She thought about the 9-day survey team and their ship. Their instruments pointed at the wrong things, filing their report and leaving. She thought about what the Marath elder had said. We watch who kicks them in. The exile had not been planned by anyone at Earth as a strategy. It had been a vote, a punishment, a door closing. And Earth had responded the way it responded to everything, by treating the closed door as a suggestion and looking for another way in. They had gone around the quarantine boundary. They had contacted the Drath. They had found the ON. They had planted settlements in places the Council's charts marked as empty. They had kicked in doors all the way out to the edge of recognized space. And out here at the edge, something very old had been watching, waiting for exactly that quality in a species. Not aggression, not sophistication, not the ability to fill out the right forms and follow the approved procedures. The willingness to just go, to kick the door and walk through and deal with whatever was on the other side. The elder made a sound. Her instruments logged it. The translation layer flagged it as emotional register, no direct equivalent, closest approximation, amusement or recognition, likely both. She looked up. It was watching her with those layered, light-shifting eyes, that she still did not fully understand. She did not know if it knew that she was putting these pieces together in real time, drawing boxes around them in a notebook, working it out the way she worked everything out, by writing it down and looking at it. But she had the strong sense, not from data but from the part of her brain that had been doing xenobiology long enough to develop instincts, that it did know, that it had been watching her figure this out the same way it had been watching everything, for a very long time, with the patience of something that understood that good things took a while to arrive. She wrote one more thing in the notebook. She did not draw a box around it. Some things did not need a box. She closed the notebook. She looked at the elder. She thought about Yara walking out of the council chamber alone. She thought about Cho's map, and all those red lines going everywhere the blue lines didn't. She thought about the UN waiting 80 years to be asked the right question. She thought, they've been waiting longer than that. She did not write that down. She left it sitting in the room, unwritten, held. The elder's pigmentation shifted into a pattern she had not logged before. She opened a new page in her notebook and started trying to understand it. 3 years after the exile, the council sent a formal invitation. It arrived on a Tuesday. It was delivered through proper diplomatic channels, on the correct form, with the correct seals, in the correct ceremonial font that the council used for documents it wanted to feel significant. It had been signed by Chair Oren and countersigned by the full council secretariat. It used the word honored 4 times, and the word regrettable twice, and the phrase in the interest of all civilized peoples once, at the end, in the way people use a phrase when they are hoping it will do more work than it can. Yara Ose read it at her desk on a Tuesday morning. She read it once through completely. Then she set it down and drank her coffee and looked out the window at the South Atlantic, which was doing what it always did, which was exist without asking anyone's permission. Then she called a cabinet meeting. The room filled up over the next 20 minutes with the people who had spent 3 years building the thing the council was now, politely and formally, and with great ceremony, asking to join. The Deputy Secretary of Expansion, who had spent those 3 years doing the work of 5 people, and had the particular look of someone who had been running on adrenaline and purpose, and was not interested in slowing down. The Trade Minister, who had maps of her own now, not as many as Cho's, but detailed in ways Cho's weren't, covering the economics of everything humanity had built in 3 years, in the spaces between the old approved corridors. Admiral Cho himself, attending via remote link from Lunar Command, visible on the screen at the end of the table in the composed, still way he was always composed and still. And others. 12 people around a table, all of them with their own versions of the past 3 years in their heads, their own red lines and blinking dots and contact logs and trade manifests. Yara put the council's letter at the center of the table where everyone can see it. She did not speak first. She let the room read it. She watched people's faces as they did. The Deputy Secretary's expression moved through several things quickly. The Trade Minister read it with her head tilted slightly, the way she read documents she was already doing math about. Cho, on the screen, read it without his expression moving at all, which told Yara exactly what he thought of it. The first person to speak was Minister Chen, who was 62 years old and had been in government long enough to remember the period before the first contact era. He set the letter down and said, "They're offering full reinstatement." "Yes," Yara said. All charges dropped. "Yes, and a formal apology from Oren. First in council history," she said, according to the letter. Chen looked at the letter again. "What do they want in return?" "Access," she said. "The routes, the contacts, they want back into the framework we've built." The room was quiet for a moment. 3 years, 43 settlements in the first 8 months, and more since then. The number was past 140 now, scattered across space that the council's maps had left blank. The draft had 3 liaison offices in human settlements and had quietly become one of Earth's most reliable trade partners, which everyone who had ever read the council's file on the draft found completely bewildering, until they thought about it for more than 30 seconds. The ON had published, jointly with Pioneer's team, 7 research papers that had dismantled significant portions of what the Council used as its foundational xenobiological science. The fringe worlds were no longer quietly resentful. They were actively realigned, doing business through human channels, attending a separate informal trade forum that Earth had started hosting, and that had no application process, and no classification rubrics, and no review cycles. And out at the edge, the Merath had opened contact. Not widely, not loud species, but they had sent ships, 3 of them, enormous, the kind of enormous that made Gateway Station look like a footnote, to human-controlled space. They had parked them at respectful distances. They had communicated, slowly, through the translation matrices Priya's team had built. And they had made it understood, in the approximate only way, that the 4th layer flagged, and Priya boxed in her notebook. That they were interested in what humanity was building, and that this interest was not casual. Species that had been watching for a very long time did not express interest casually. The Council, watching all of this from inside its clean blue lines, had finally understood what it had done 3 years ago in that enormous chamber on Veltari Station. It had understood it slowly, the way you understood something that you did not want to understand. In pieces, gap by gap, chart by chart, emergency session by emergency session. It had looked at humanity and found it too chaotic, too wrong-footed, too unwilling to follow the approved framework, and it had removed it from the equation. And humanity had gone and built a different equation. "Do we go back?" Chen asked. The room looked at Yara. She had been sitting with this question since the letter arrived. She had been sitting with a version of it since long before the letter. Since the moment in the transit corridor on Veltari Station 3 years ago, when something had moved across her face that she had not let anyone see. She looked at the letter on the table. She looked at the window and the Atlantic beyond it. She thought about the 47-page document she had been drafting and revising and waiting to use for 2 years before the exile. The one that had never been about asking permission. The one that had always been about what happened after. She reached into the folder in front of her and took out the document and placed it on the table next to the Council's letter. "We go back," she said, "on these terms." People leaned in to read. The room got quiet in the particular way it got quiet when people were reading something that was going to require a lot of thought. 47 pages, the full version, updated across 3 years of editions, trade framework revisions, reclassification requirements for species the Council had dismissed or filed away or never bothered to look at properly. Structural changes to how the Council's membership worked. New membership categories. The last item on page 47 was the one that made the room go very still. Earth was nominating species for full Council membership. The Drath, the ON, 12 fringe world civilizations that,